It was a remarkably unremarkable photograph, marred by the harsh, color-sapping glare of fluorescent hospital lighting. The sterile beams caught the flyaways in Kate's half-undone hair after a grueling 12-hour shift, casting exhausted shadows beneath her eyes. Beside her, a nameless guy in scrubs cracked up at something just out of frame, while Kate herself was caught mid-laugh with her head tilted back, blissfully oblivious to the camera's lens. She uploaded the image at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening with a simple caption, celebrating small victories and finding their first genuine laugh since Monday. The post gathered a meager 11 likes, including a crying laughing emoji from her friend Priya and an obligatory thumbs up from her mother before slipping down the feed. Yet, tucked away in the data, a single silent view registered from a phantom account devoid of a profile picture or any posts of its own. Kate tossed her phone into her locker without a second glance. The pad of her thumb never even hovered over the viewer list, her mind already shifting back to the relentless hum of the ward and the sharp sting of hand sanitizer nestled in her paper cuts. To her, the upload was nothing more than a fleeting distraction on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. 41 floors above the sprawling concrete of Midtown Manhattan, Chris Borelli's corner office offered floor-to-ceiling panoramas on 3 sides, granting him an unobstructed view of the Hudson River and the distinct sensation of owning every city block stretching out below him. His massive mahogany desk anchored the room like a command center, meticulously scheduled with a 4:00 p.m. Singapore acquisition pitch, a 5:00 p.m. call with the mayor's office regarding a crucial West Side zoning variance, and an evening reservation at 11 Madison Park to shake hands with men whose signatures moved millions. As the digital clock on his desk flicked to 6:52 p.m., he dismantled the entire evening with a single swipe. Marcus, his executive assistant, knocked twice before stepping into the hushed suite. He found Chris standing rigidly by the window. The thick leather of Chris's custom armchair creaked faintly beneath the weight of his discarded suit jacket, draped with the careless grace of a man entirely at ease among extreme wealth. His phone lay face down on the pristine blotter. "The Singapore team is asking if we can reschedule to Thursday," Chris interrupted, his voice tight. "And the mayor's Friday. Push everything to Friday." Marcus hesitated, the plush wool carpet suddenly feeling unstable beneath his loafers. In 14 months of gatekeeping for Chris Borelli, a cancellation of the mayor's office was entirely unprecedented. "Is everything okay?" Chris slowly turned away from the sprawling skyline. His expression carried a profound, unrecognizable weight, bearing the sudden stillness of a freight train that had slammed its brakes after decades of forward momentum. His jaw was set so firmly that a small muscle feathered against his cheek, betraying the silent storm roaring behind his dark eyes. "Call the car," Chris murmured, the command absolute. "I need to go to Manhattan General." The metallic click of the office door closing behind Marcus echoed through the cavernous suite, leaving Chris entirely alone with the phantom image burning in his retinas. A single pixelated laugh had just severed his ironclad routine, pulling him violently backward through time. The rich scent of expensive cologne and the hum of the ozone purifier vanished from his senses, replaced entirely by the phantom, sterile sting of alcohol prep pads and hospital bleach. He was plunging backward to October, to the chaotic, blindingly bright emergency room on the Upper East Side. That was the night the trajectory of his life had shattered against a dark-haired woman armed with a clipboard and an absolute intolerance for arrogance. A woman who had walked into Trauma Bay 4 and irrevocably altered his world, completely unaware of the wreckage she would leave in her wake. It was a Thursday night in October when Christopher Borelli, Billionaire, arrived at Manhattan General's emergency department in the back of a blacked-out Escalade, presenting the chaotic, terrifying symptoms of a cardiac episode. His blood pressure was surging. His heart rate was a frantic, erratic drumbeat. He was sweating straight through the fine weave of a $3,000 bespoke shirt. The paramedics who hauled him through the sliding doors had no reason to question a single metric. Men with too much money and an excess of stress suffered catastrophic medical emergencies every day in this city, and Christopher Borelli was the very picture of corporate collapse. What the paramedics didn't know, what no one in that sterile, Rushing Building could possibly fathom was that Chris had spent 40 agonizing minutes locked in his penthouse bathroom meticulously orchestrating this exact presentation. The elevated blood pressure was a calculated cocktail of concentrated caffeine, raw anxiety, and a sequence of controlled hyperventilation he had practiced twice in front of his mirror. The sweat, however, was partially genuine. It turned out that lying to a hospital full of highly trained medical professionals was a profoundly stressful endeavor. He had his reasons. He had been repeating those reasons like a mantra for 2 months, letting them harden into a twisted sort of logic that propelled him into the back of the ambulance. Kate Leigh had been on her feet for 11 grueling hours when they wheeled him into Bay 4. She was exactly 30 seconds away from wearing down her attending enough to secure a break. Her stomach was a hollow ache, and she was desperate for real food, not the chalky protein bars from the vending machine, but an actual meal consumed while sitting in a chair and staring blankly at a wall. Then, her pager violently vibrated against her hip. Possible cardiac, Bay 4, present immediately. She sprinted down the linoleum corridor, reaching the bay in under a minute. She snatched the chart from the triage nurse's hand, her eyes scanning the vital signs before she even looked at the man on the gurney. "Mr. Borelli, I'm Dr. Leigh. I need you to—" She glanced up from the clipboard. He was staring at her. He wasn't tracking the chaotic swirl of nurses. He wasn't looking at the blinding fluorescent ceiling panels, and he wasn't watching the IV needle sliding into his vein. He was locked onto her. His gaze was impossibly sharp, anchoring onto her face as if she were the only solid object in a room that was spinning out of control. Kate froze for a fraction of a second. She recognized the type instantly, the high-maintenance VIP whose very presence demanded an audience, the kind of man who expected the laws of biology to bend to his net worth. Usually these guys were screaming for a private suite or threatening to buy the hospital. This one, however, was just watching her with a quiet, terrifying intensity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. It was annoying. It was distracting. And she absolutely did not have time for it. She processed the anomaly and made the immediate clinical decision to ignore it entirely. She had a job to do and a dying man to save, or so she thought. "Chest pain?" she asked, clicking her pen light on and shining it across his pupils. "More like pressure," he managed, his voice tight. "Scale of 1 to 10. 6. Radiating to the arm? A little. Left side." She was already moving. She pressed the cold bell of her stethoscope firmly against his chest, leaning in close. Beneath the sweat-soaked silk of his shirt, his heart was hammering. Fast, yes, but the rhythm felt manufactured. It lacked the erratic, desperate flutter of a failing muscle. It felt driven, almost theatrical. A prickle of suspicion flared at the base of her neck, but she forced her focus back to the diagnostics. "How long has the pressure been there?" she asked, her voice entirely flat. "Since around 4. Any history of cardiac issues?" "No." "Family history?" "Father had a bypass at 62. Kate stepped back, letting the stethoscope drop around her neck, and actually looked at him. He was in his mid-30s. His dark hair was slightly damp at the temples, clinging to skin that was a shade too pale. He had a jawline that looked entirely too expensive for an emergency room, but it was his brown eyes that bothered her the most. They were entirely too aware, too calculating for a man in the throes of a medical crisis. He carried the unmistakable aura of a man who was used to rooms rearranging themselves around his gravity, and he was looking at her like he was genuinely, helplessly surprised that she hadn't yet shifted her orbit. "I'm going to order an EKG and blood work," she stated, making a sharp note on his chart. "Don't move." "I wasn't planning on it." The corner of his mouth twitched upward, a microscopic, almost imperceptible shift. Kate spun on her heel and walked out. She mentally catalogued the orders for the phlebotomist, stubbornly ignoring the sudden, irritating flush of heat creeping up her neck and the lingering weight of his stare burning into her spine. The EKG printed out flawlessly clean. The troponin levels were perfectly normal. By the time Kate returned to deliver the results, his blood pressure had begun its steady descent back to baseline. The narrative he had constructed about high-stakes stress, overwork, and chronic insomnia held up against her rapid-fire questioning. There was no medical justification to keep him overnight. Kate knew the protocols backward and forward. She admitted him anyway. She rationalized it as standard observation for a possible cardiac event. Both of those terms were technically accurate enough to satisfy the insurance codes. But beneath the clinical justifications, a quieter, more stubborn truth gnawed at her. The cadence of his answers had been too smooth, too rehearsed for a man who believed he was having a heart attack. He hadn't asked if he was going to die. He hadn't panicked. He had just watched her. She had built her entire medical career on trusting her instincts when the math didn't add up, and Christopher Borelli was a wildly incorrect equation. Chris offered zero resistance. He allowed the nurses to wheel him up to a private room on the 4th floor. He made a brief, hushed phone call to Marcus to cancel his evening, and then spent the next 3 hours scrolling through quarterly reports on his phone, his eyes repeatedly darting toward the heavy wooden door of his room. Kate returned just after midnight during her final rounds. The hospital had settled into its deep night hush. "Still here?" Chris noted. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room, an observation that was both entirely obvious and completely unnecessary. Yet the sound of it acted like a physical tether, stopping Kate mid-stride. "Still monitoring," she replied, not looking up from his chart. "Do you do that with all your patients?" "Do what?" she asked, finally meeting his eyes. "Look at them like you're solving a problem they don't know they have." Kate held his gaze for a long, silent beat. She could hear the faint, rhythmic beep of the monitor tracking his perfectly healthy heart, measuring the tension stretching tight between the foot of his bed and the doorway. "Get some sleep, Mr. Borelli." She turned and left. He watched her go. He tracked her movement down the dimly lit hallway, past the glowing monitors of the nurses' station, all the way to the heavy fire doors of the stairwell. He watched until the door swung shut behind her. His hands rested on the glossy pages of his unread portfolio, the heavy antiseptic silence of the hospital floor pressing in around him. It wasn't peace he felt. It was the sudden dizzying absence of his own performance. Outside his 4th floor window, the scattered lights of the Upper East Side burned with a steady, indifferent glow. Christopher Borelli, a man who commanded every conceivable advantage this city had to offer, sat propped up in a hospital bed he had effectively purchased, utterly consumed by the thought of a woman who hadn't spent a single second of the last 4 hours trying to impress him. He had known exactly who Kate Leigh was long before he stepped into that ambulance. She didn't know a single true thing about him that wasn't printed on his medical chart. As he stared out into the dark city, a strange hollow ache settled in his chest, a real one this time. For the first time in years, the sterile, glaring light of that hospital room felt like the most honest place he had ever been. 3 days later, Christopher Borelli strolled through the sliding glass doors of the hospital's outpatient clinic, clutching a pristine referral from his personal cardiologist. The specialist had been utterly baffled by the request, reminding his billionaire client that his heart was operating with perfect rhythmic efficiency during a comprehensive exam just 2 weeks prior. Chris had simply handed over his black Amex and instructed the man to humor him. When the paperwork landed on Dr. Kate Leigh's desk at 8 o'clock that morning, she stared at the heavy cardstock. A deeply pragmatic woman who fiercely guarded her independence, Kate possessed a razor-sharp self-awareness that usually allowed her to spot trouble miles before it reached her doorstep. She saw Christopher Borelli coming. She recognized the specific gravitational pull of a man who refused to be dismissed, yet she deliberately scheduled him for noon on Thursday, approaching the impending collision with both hands firmly gripping the emergency brake. Their initial follow-up was an exercise in rigid clinical boundaries. Kate maintained her armor as Dr. Leigh, treating him strictly as Mr. Borelli while she methodically charted his perfectly normal vitals and dryly suggested stress management techniques. He absorbed the advice with a polite, unreadable expression. The only crack in the sterile atmosphere occurred when she reached for his chart a fraction of a second before he released it, their knuckles brushing the air just millimeters apart. He immediately scheduled a second follow-up, and she signed the authorization while pointedly studying her pen. By the time he returned, the heavy formalities had begun to fray at the edges. The stifling quiet of the exam room gave way when Chris casually critiqued the framed anatomy poster on her wall, noting that the bubbly, sans serif font labeling the left ventricle was aesthetically inappropriate for an organ under such immense biological pressure. A sudden, genuine laugh escaped Kate's throat before she could suppress it. The sound surprised them both, lingering in the cramped room and subtly shifting the air pressure between them. From that moment, the appointments bled past their allotted 15 minutes. Chris started asking questions that had absolutely nothing to do with arrhythmias or blood panels, and Kate found herself answering them. When she vaguely outlined a challenging, anonymized case while walking him to the elevators, he listened with a rare, absolute stillness. He didn't formulate a response while she spoke, or wait impatiently for his turn to dominate the conversation. His undivided attention felt like a physical weight settling over her shoulders, a quiet, anchoring focus that Kate found deeply unsettling in its sincerity. She mentally filed the sensation under irrelevant and forced herself to walk away. Late November brought a biting chill to the city and a collision by the hospital's lobby coffee cart. Kate was miserably clutching a lukewarm, burnt roast after a grueling consult when she nearly ran into Chris, who had arrived 14 minutes early for his third appointment. "There's a Gregory's 2 blocks from here," he observed, eyeing the sad paper cup in her hand. "I know," she sighed. "That's worse than the sludge they were serving here in 2019. "I know that too. And yet," she agreed, taking a masochistic sip with absolute composure. He bought her a proper Americano after the appointment. The simple fact that she let him pay for it was a concession she adamantly refused to examine. They lingered on the freezing sidewalk for 20 minutes, ignoring the roar of traffic and the 40-degree wind biting at their coats. Chris argued that Manhattan was at its most honest in the dead of winter, while Kate countered that the city was merely tolerable if you dressed practically and refused to romanticize the misery. He offered a low, rumbling laugh at that, a genuine sound entirely stripped of his usual corporate polish. She thought about the rough cadence of that laugh later that evening, lulled by the rhythmic screech of the subway taking her back to Brooklyn. A dangerous, familiar warmth had begun to pool at the base of her throat whenever his name appeared on her schedule. It was the terrifying, undeniable physical symptom of a woman slowly realizing she was developing a very real weakness for a man she was supposed to be treating. She buried her face in her medical journal, desperately trying to suffocate the realization before it could take root. December ushered in 2 completely unnecessary appointments and a blurred evening where they sat in the hospital cafe long after the dinner rush. The custodial staff had already begun stacking chairs on the surrounding tables before Kate finally glanced at the wall clock, stunned to realize she had been off the clock for over 2 hours. "I have to go," she murmured, gathering her bag. "I know," Chris replied quietly. She paused at the door, turning back to him. "You're a functional adult, Mr. Borelli. You have zero medical need for a follow-up next week." He met her gaze with an unwavering intensity. "I know." Kate held her breath, the silence stretching out a dangerous beat too long before she pushed through the heavy glass doors and escaped into the biting cold. On the swaying subway ride home, she pulled her phone from her coat pocket, her thumb hovering over the screen. She shoved it back into the wool lining, only to pull it out a minute later to type a terse message to her best friend, Priya. "I think I have a problem." 3 animated dots danced immediately across the screen. Then, "Tell me everything." Kate stared at the harsh blue light of the display as the train rattled through a dark tunnel. Later, she typed, "I'm not ready to say it out loud yet." The silence of her apartment was deafening. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, her face stripped of its usual clinical armor, simply assessing the exhausted, conflicted woman staring back at her. She finally turned off the light and slid into bed, where she lay wide awake staring at the ceiling shadows for 40 agonizing minutes. For a woman who had built her entire existence around an ironclad independence, she was failing spectacularly at keeping Christopher Borelli out of her head. Mid-January brought the kind of brutal Tuesday that follows a relentlessly awful Monday, demanding nothing short of collective gallows humor from the entire ward. Kate had been on her feet for an 11-hour shift, carrying the heavy, unspoken weight of a patient outcome that no one on the floor dared to discuss aloud. By 6 in the evening, her exhaustion had bypassed physical fatigue entirely, settling into her bones as a dull, hollow ache. Dr. James Park, a cardiology fellow and Kate's closest confidant, the only person permitted to breach her office uninvited, wielding emergency snacks, rapped his knuckles against the break room door at 6:30. He proudly presented a chalky protein bar slated to expire the following month, declaring it a celebration simply because they had survived until Tuesday evening. A laugh ripped out of Kate's throat. It was beautifully unguarded and raw, lacking the polished restraint she usually maintained during hospital hours. James lifted his phone to capture the moment just as she raised the tragic protein bar in a mock toast. She typed out a quick caption about small victories and finding their first laugh since Monday, uploaded the image without a second thought, and abandoned her phone in her locker to return to her rounds. 30 miles and 40 floors away, Christopher Borelli sat immobilized behind his desk, the harsh glow of his screen illuminating the rigid lines of his jaw. He had been staring at the photograph for 4 agonizing minutes. He recognized James Park immediately, having quietly run background checks on every colleague in Kate's immediate orbit. A severe overstep he usually justified by burying himself in quarterly reports. Now the undeniable evidence was staring back at him. She was laughing. It was a radiant, breathless sound he had only managed to drag out of her twice, both times requiring immense effort to keep his own expression neutral. Yet here she was, glowing under fluorescent lights, sharing that private joy with another man in a world that belonged entirely to her long before Chris ever walked through the emergency room doors. He shoved the phone face down onto his mahogany blotter, then snatched it right back up, his chest tightening with a suffocating realization. The burning sensation clawing at his throat was a profound, undeniable clarity that he could no longer outrun. He shot up from his leather chair, grabbed his tailored overcoat, and sharply instructed Marcus to clear his entire evening schedule. The concrete cavern of the hospital's parking structure echoed with the damp hum of winter as Kate dug her keys from her coat pocket. She froze at the sudden sound of her name. Chris stood near the entrance, looking distinctly out of place beneath the flickering yellow security lights. He wore his heavy wool coat with a stillness that suggested he had driven across the city without a single thought as to what he would actually do once he arrived. Kate. The sudden intimacy of her first name on his lips sent a sharp jolt down her spine. "You canceled dinner with half of Manhattan to come to a parking garage," she observed, her voice deliberately steady. "I did." "Why?" He closed the distance between them with slow, measured steps, offering her every opportunity to turn away. She remained rooted to the concrete, the jagged metal of her car keys pressing painfully into her palm. "Because I've been trying to be patient," he murmured, his voice echoing softly in the cavernous space. "And I'm not actually good at it. That surprises absolutely no one." "I know." He stopped just inches away, invading her personal space with a deliberate magnetic pull. "I should have said something 3 months ago. But you're not someone you rush." She forced herself to meet his dark eyes. "You're not someone I should get involved with. You're a patient. Technically, my last appointment was 6 weeks ago." "Chris." "Kate." The heavy silence of the garage pressed in around them, punctuated only by the distant, muffled slam of a car door on the level above. Kate finally looked away, the sheer intensity of his gaze threatening to unravel the meticulous boundaries she had spent years building. "I need to think. I don't do things without thinking them through." "I know. You're a billionaire who showed up to a parking garage on a Tuesday night because—" She gestured vaguely at the charged air between them, at a loss for words. "Yeah," he replied, the simplicity of his answer hanging heavy in the cold air. A betraying smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She managed to catch it halfway, but when she glanced back up, the softness remained etched across her features. "Give me the weekend. Take whatever you need." She brushed past him, her shoulder grazing his wool coat, and unlocked her car. With her hand resting on the icy door handle, she paused. "How did you even know I was still here?" Chris offered only silence, a quiet confirmation of the obsessive depths he had already sunk to. Kate slipped into the driver's seat and pulled out onto the FDR drive. As the city lights blurred past her windshield, that suppressed, halfway smile blossomed into something real and terrifying in the safety of the dark cabin. She promised herself she would wait until Monday to pretend she hadn't already made up her mind. She didn't even make it to Sunday. By Saturday afternoon, she was dialing his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice a low hum against her ear. "I'm not promising anything," she stated flatly. "I know," he replied, "and I want to make that very clear. I heard you." The line went quiet for a fraction of a second before he asked, "Are you free tonight?" He ruthlessly dismantled 2 high-stakes corporate engagements just to hear her say yes. Kate disconnected the call and dropped her phone onto the mattress, burying her face in her hands. The frantic, exhausting war she had been waging against her own pulse was finally over. The suffocating tightness in her chest, the rigid posture she held whenever he walked into a room, the sheer, draining effort of pretending she was immune to him, it all evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, weightless relief. She dragged a shaky breath into her lungs, the familiar scent of her own lavender laundry detergent grounding her as she finally surrendered to the undeniable gravity pulling her straight toward him. February hit New York with its usual unapologetic brutality, whipping icy wind through the concrete canyons. Kate and Chris had been officially navigating their relationship for 3 weeks. It was a fragile, intoxicating period of mapping each other's hidden topographies. The heavy, brooding silence Chris retreated into when frustrated, and the razor-sharp sarcasm Kate deployed as a shield before finally softening into vulnerability. They had reached that rare echelon of comfort where they could simply exist in the same room, shedding the exhausting armor of performance. She had kept the circle of trust small. Priya knew the details. James had deduced the truth with unnerving medical precision. Kate's mother received only the barest biographical sketch, just enough to stave off an interrogation. Things felt solid. The warmth of his hand against the small of her back had begun to quiet the defensive instincts she had honed over a lifetime. She was finally, terrifyingly, allowing herself to believe in the ground beneath her feet, completely unaware of the massive fault line waiting to snap open. The fracture began on a bitterly cold Thursday evening inside his Park Avenue penthouse, a sprawling monument to clean lines and clinical perfection. Kate was curled on the imported leather sofa, casually hunting for a pen while Chris fielded a late conference call in his home office. The drawer of the sleek side table sat ajar. The pen was there, resting carelessly atop a thick manila folder she would have completely ignored had the tab not caught the ambient light. Printed in stark, unforgiving black ink was her own name, Leigh, Katherine A. She flipped the heavy cover open before her brain could process the violation. The thick, premium paper felt strangely cold against her fingertips. Page 1 was a forensic dissection of her existence. Full name, date of birth, medical school transcripts, residency records, and her mother's exact address in Queens. Her breath hitched in her throat as she scanned 3 pages of meticulously annotated professional history, including a highly confidential performance evaluation stripped from a sealed hospital database. The second section ruthlessly laid bare her finances, a confirmed salary bracket, an accurate estimation of her crippling student loans, and the modest savings she had bled to build in an unforgiving city. Section 3 dissolved into the intensely personal. Color-printed photographs from her college graduation stared back at her alongside archived social media posts she had deleted years ago. There, glaring under the lamplight, was the name of a man she had dated in her late 20s, sterilized with a single typed word, ended, followed by the exact date. She slammed the folder shut. Her pulse hammered a sickening, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Desperate, she ripped it open again, praying the dim lighting had played a trick on her exhausted eyes. The ink remained unchanged. Chris stepped into the doorway, wrapping up a sentence about Singapore logistics, when the words died in his throat. He saw her sitting rigidly on the sofa, the open dossier resting in her lap. "Kate? When was this done?" Her voice was devoid of inflection, anchored entirely by 11 grueling years of emergency room discipline. He crossed the Persian rug and sank onto the chair opposite her, making no move to confiscate the file. "Before the hospital." "How long before?" "About a month." Kate stared at him, then down at the damning pages. A strange, suffocating numbness bloomed in the center of her chest, a profound displacement far heavier than ordinary anger. It was the absolute vertigo of realizing every memory they had built was constructed over a hollow sinkhole. You had me investigated before you ever met me. Yes, and the hospital. Her voice trailed off. The final devastating puzzle piece clicked into place, turning the blood in her veins to ice. You were never sick. The sprawling, opulent penthouse absorbed the silence. Kate stood up. She placed the folder back on the sofa with agonizing, surgical precision. The sheer restraint of the gesture carried far more violence than if she had hurled it across the room. You faked a cardiac episode, she stated, the syllables clipping the air. To get me to treat you. Because you'd already had me researched and decided you wanted to engineer a situation where you had the upper hand. You built this entire reality on a manufactured lie. What I felt was always, I have zero interest in hearing that right now. She grabbed her heavy wool coat from the armrest. I need you to not contact me. Kate, please listen. I am asking you, she cut in, her tone absolute, as clearly as I know how, to never contact me again. She pulled the heavy oak door open, pausing for a fraction of a second. She didn't look furious. Her expression had completely flatlined, the shutters pulled tight over a house that had just been abandoned to the winter. I trusted you, she whispered. That is not something I give away. She walked out into the corridor, the latch clicking shut with agonizing finality. Chris remained paralyzed in the suffocating luxury of his apartment long after the echoing click of the door faded. The manila folder sat on the leather cushion like an unexploded bomb. He had arrogantly convinced himself that the mechanics of his deception wouldn't matter as long as the emotion behind it was genuine. He had wanted her with such a blinding, absolute hunger that he had simply bypassed her right to choose, systematically stripping away her agency to engineer the perfect collision. Now, staring at the empty space she had just occupied, the brutal arrogance of that choice crushed the breath out of him. He had stripped a woman who fiercely guarded her independence of the one thing she valued most, the truth. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city pulsed with indifferent, glowing life. He had commanded this skyline for 2 decades, yet he had never felt the crushing weight of its silence until those agonizing 40 minutes after her departure. His phone buzzed twice with messages from Marcus. He ignored the screen. The familiar hollow void he had spent 10 years burying beneath corporate acquisitions, endless meetings in crowded boardrooms violently ripped back open. Only this time, the emptiness wasn't vague. It bore the exact dimensions of Dr. Kate Leigh. He had always known this catastrophic detonation was a mathematical probability. He had arrogantly filed it away as a problem to handle when the time came. The time had arrived, and he suddenly understood with sickening clarity that he hadn't even earned the right to utter an apology. March in New York arrived with a chaotic, biting indecision, refusing to commit to the thaw of spring. Kate found a grim comfort in the brutal honesty of the weather, wrapping herself in her heavy wool coat as she forced her life back into its familiar, grueling rhythms. She buried herself in endless 12-hour shifts, drank bitter coffee from the lobby cart, and deflected Priya's concerned texts with long clinical paragraphs. During a quiet Sunday dinner in Queens, her mother took one look at the hollow exhaustion bracketing Kate's eyes, asked a single careful question about the billionaire she had stopped mentioning, and mercifully let the subject drop. The daylight hours were manageable, packed with enough trauma and triage to crowd out the ghosts, but the nights were entirely ruthless. The searing, protective heat of her initial anger had quickly burned itself out, leaving behind a suffocating, echoing quiet. Her body was betraying her with a cruel muscle memory. She would read a ridiculous chart note or spot a bizarre headline on her subway commute, and her thumb would instinctively hover over her messages to text him, only for the crushing reality of his absence to slam into her ribs all over again. The phantom weight of his hand lingering on her spine haunted her empty apartment, turning the simple act of trying to fall asleep into an exhausting daily battle against her own longing. Chris had attempted to breach the silence exactly twice during that first bleak week. His single text remained unread, and his lone phone call was immediately sent to voicemail. The sudden surrender surprised Kate, who had braced herself for a relentless siege from a man accustomed to buying or bullying his way through any obstacle. She had no way of knowing that Chris's business partner, Daniel Park, had cornered him in the boardroom that Monday. Leaning over the polished mahogany with the blunt authority of 15 years of friendship, Daniel had verbally dismantled Chris's instinct to fix the mess. He warned Chris that showing up at the hospital would only cement his role as the villain, brutally reminding him that a shattered trust dictated its own timeline. Pushing her, Daniel had argued, would only prove that Chris's desperate need for absolution was still more important than Kate's right to process the betrayal. The words had landed like a physical blow to Chris's chest. He retreated into the sprawling, silent vacuum of his penthouse, forced to sit with the agonizing realization that his wealth was completely useless here. For the first time in his adult life, he had to learn the excruciating patience of true accountability. By the third week of March, a massive financial injection quietly cleared the hospital's foundation accounts. It was officially registered as an anonymous donation. Yet the funds were surgically earmarked for the cardiology clinic's uninsured patient program, a department so critically underfunded and highly specific that only someone with intimate insider knowledge of Kate's daily frustrations could have targeted it deliberately. James delivered the news in the fluorescent glare of the cafeteria, casually mentioning the massive, nameless endowment between bites of his sandwich. He muttered something about a heavy, guilty conscience. Kate stabbed at her wilted salad, her jaw tight. Or someone is just trying to write a check for their own forgiveness, she countered, the bitterness sharp on her tongue. Could be both, James replied gently, watching the defensive posture rigid in her shoulders. It's a lifeline, Kate. Regardless of the signature on the wire transfer, 12 desperate people are getting cardiac monitors next month. Kate sank into the cracked vinyl of the break room sofa at 2 in the morning, the metallic scent of a marathon surgery still clinging to her scrubs. Her brilliant, analytical mind understood exactly how the psychology of an anonymous apology functioned. When a grand gesture demands no applause and asks for zero recognition, it violently disarms the anger you use to protect yourself. Knowing the mechanics of his strategy didn't stop the tectonic plates of her grief from shifting. She stared at the buzzing vending machine, the harsh sting of his betrayal morphing into a deep, resonant ache. She was nowhere near ready to forgive Christopher Borelli. Her defenses remained heavily fortified, but as she traced the rim of her cold coffee cup, she quietly acknowledged that the shape of her pain had changed, softening from an impenetrable wall into a heavily guarded door. The crisp, deceptive chill of early April clung to the hospital's east courtyard. He found her tucked away in this hidden sanctuary far from the bustling main lobby, sitting perfectly still among 3 weathered benches and a cluster of stubborn dogwood trees that had forced their premature blossoms open against the frost. Kate cradled a steaming paper cup of coffee, her phone buried somewhere in her bag, her gaze fixed securely on the concrete path. Chris hesitated at the wrought iron gate, stripped of his corner office, his fleet of black cars, and the suffocating gravity of his immense wealth. He was reduced to a remarkably ordinary man, terrified of stepping on shattered glass. Kate sensed his presence instantly, her posture stiffening. She remained firmly seated. "I'm not leaving," she stated, her voice slicing through the crisp air. "This is my hospital." "I know," Chris replied softly. He crossed the courtyard with agonizingly measured steps, stopping a respectful distance from her bench. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his wool coat, anchoring himself against the urge to reach out for her. "Can I sit?" The silence stretched taut. Without ever lifting her eyes to meet his, Kate dragged her leather tote bag off the wooden slats, leaving a deliberate, gaping space beside her. It was a breathtaking surrender of power. A man accustomed to demanding the world was standing at the edge of a garden, quietly terrified that a single word from a tired doctor could banish him completely. He waited for her permission, painfully aware that she held every ounce of authority. He lowered himself onto the bench. The muted, rhythmic thrum of Manhattan traffic pulsed over the brick walls, a steady baseline to the deafening quiet suspended between them. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive me," he finally murmured. "Good." Chris exhaled, a ragged cloud of white breath curling into the chill. "I've been trying to figure out how to articulate something that lacks any justifiable defense. I desperately need you to understand what actually happened." even if it doesn't change a single thing between us. I want to explain this without sounding like I'm trying to extract a concession from you." Kate stared intently at the swirling black surface of her coffee. "Talk." He laid it all bare. He recounted a dreary layover 11 months prior, staring blankly at a muted airport terminal television playing a panel discussion on hospital funding. He described watching a wealthy, arrogant donor deliver a profoundly condescending question, fully expecting her gratitude. He remembered the exact, chilling precision of Kate's response, the way her spine had straightened, delivering a beautifully unapologetic counter-argument that dismantled the man's ego on live television. Chris had tracked down the footage and replayed it 4 times in his penthouse. He was captivated by a woman who utterly refused to mold herself to ensure the comfort of the men around her. He confessed how she had embedded herself in his mind over the following 2 months. She became a brilliant, grounding fixed point in a corporate existence that had grown increasingly hollow and abstract. Then he confessed to the research. He admitted, with brutal candor, that his immense resources allowed him to dissect her life before they ever met, and that he had deployed that power without a single thought for her autonomy. "I rationalized it as being thorough," he admitted, his voice rough. "But I was just executing my usual playbook, hoarding information to completely dominate an outcome. I treated you like an acquisition, completely ignoring your right to let your own life unfold naturally." "No," Kate agreed, her tone dangerously flat. "You didn't. I knew the hospital stunt was a catastrophic violation the moment I walked through the doors. I arrogantly convinced myself that my feelings justified the manipulation." He dragged a hand over his jaw. "That isn't an excuse. It's just the ugly truth of what I did." Kate finally turned her head, her exhausted eyes locking onto his. "What do you want from me, Chris?" she asked, the question devoid of malice, carrying only a bone-deep exhaustion. "Nothing. I just need you to know that every single second we spent together after that night in the ER was entirely real. I am incapable of manufacturing what those months were." He swallowed hard. "I just needed you to know the feeling was honest, even if the foundation was entirely rotten." The garden seemed to hold its breath. A sudden gust of wind shook a shower of pale petals from the dogwood branches, drifting into the heavy space between their shoulders. "I know it was real," Kate whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "That is exactly what makes this so incredibly difficult." Chris gave a slow, solemn nod. "I need time," she continued, gripping her paper cup until the cardboard buckled. "And I need you to completely stop trying to fix it. I have to untangle this on my own without you breathing down my neck." "Okay. I mean it, Chris. I know you do." He met her gaze, his expression entirely stripped of his usual armor. "I am not going anywhere. I will wait as long as it takes." Kate studied his face. The impenetrable fortress she had erected behind her eyes hadn't crumbled, but the deadbolt had subtly unlocked. She was finally looking at him not as a billionaire who had orchestrated a massive deception, but simply as a man bleeding out from a self-inflicted wound. "I should go back inside," she murmured, rising from the bench. "I know." She walked toward the glass doors of the lobby, but paused at the threshold, her hand hovering over the heavy brass handle. She didn't turn around. "The uninsured program you funded," she called back softly. "The cardiac monitors." Chris remained perfectly still. "It has already saved a life." She let the words hang in the cold air. "That is not forgiveness, Chris. I just thought you should know." She pushed through the doors and vanished into the sterile, rushing world of the hospital. Chris remained anchored to the wooden bench for another 20 minutes. A scrub nurse hurried down the path, offering him a polite, unrecognizing nod. The suffocating, cavernous void that had been devouring his chest for weeks suddenly shifted. As he watched a stray dogwood petal settle onto the concrete, the crushing agony of her absence morphed into a terrifying, fragile spark of hope. He had lost everything his money could buy, only to discover that the agonizing, unpredictable wait for her return was the only thing holding any actual value. It wasn't redemption yet, but for the first time in his life, Christopher Borelli was finally learning how to earn it. Kate allowed herself exactly 21 days of absolute distance. She wasn't running a punitive clock or forcing him to sweat for the sake of petty revenge. She simply required the heavy, uninterrupted silence of her apartment to let the jagged pieces of the last few months settle into their natural configuration. She needed to untangle the facts from the feelings. She had reached a few concrete conclusions. He had committed a violation she flatly refused to justify. The meticulous research and the orchestrated hospital encounter were devastating breaches of the fundamental autonomy she demanded from the world. Yet running parallel to that undeniable truth was another, equally stubborn fact. The 4 months suspended between that initial lie and the manila folder had been completely authentic. The quiet, unguarded cadence of their evenings together possessed a specific gravity that simply couldn't be fabricated in a boardroom. She spent the longest time sitting with the origin of his deception. Christopher Borelli had navigated his entire adult life, wielding a level of corporate power that completely eradicated the need for patience or vulnerability. When he wanted something, he executed a ruthless strategy to acquire it. His pursuit of her was an incredibly flawed, deeply human panic response from a man who had entirely forgotten how to exist in the terrifying space of the unknown. Acknowledging that didn't magically absolve him, but it translated his actions into a language she could finally decipher. The final decision crystallized on a quiet Sunday morning before the chaotic hum of the city had fully awakened. The April air was thick with gray fog as Kate stood in her small kitchen, wrapping her hands around a chipped mug of black coffee. She didn't draft a cautious text message or hide behind the safety of a screen. She picked up her phone and dialed his number, letting the line ring out into the penthouse miles away. He picked up on the second ring. "Hi," she breathed into the receiver. "Hi," Chris replied. The line stretched tight with a heavy pause, and she could actually hear the physical effort it took for him to swallow his usual commanding instinct and simply wait for her to lead. "How are you?" "I've been thinking. I figured." "I have conditions," she stated, her voice anchored in a clinical absolute. "Real ones, not negotiating points." A beat of silence, then, "Tell me." She laid out the boundaries like surgical steel. He was never to gather information about her without her explicit consent again. He would practice absolute, uncompromising transparency regarding anything that might affect her. He was permanently barred from substituting grand, expensive gestures for difficult honesty. Finally, if he ever felt the pathological urge to manage a situation involving her, he had to ask her first. She was a partner, not a corporate acquisition. He agreed to every single term. He didn't fire back with quick, pacifying automated responses. She heard the heavy, deliberate silence of a man weighing the immense gravity of the promises he was making. "I'm not starting over," Kate continued, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to unspool. "I refuse to pretend the last 3 months didn't happen. What we built was something tangible. I'm simply willing to see what it looks like when we build it with the truth. That is all I want." Chris exhaled, his voice suddenly thick with relief. "Kate, honestly, that's more than I—" "Don't get emotional on me, Borelli," she interrupted, a faint, undeniable warmth bleeding into her tone. "I haven't forgiven you yet. I know. I'm working on it." "I know that too." Outside her frosty window, the city was slowly shaking off its slumber, settling into the unhurried rhythm of the weekend. "Are you free tonight?" she asked. "I am canceling 3 things right now to say yes." "I know you are." This time, she allowed the smile to fully break across her face. "Just meet me somewhere incredibly normal. Absolutely nowhere with a dress code." His laugh traveled through the speaker, that low, rough, entirely private sound she hadn't heard in nearly a month. It landed directly in the center of her chest, warming the exact spot that had been aching since February. "There's a tiny place in the West Village," he suggested, his tone lifting. "The food is excellent, the wine list is a tragedy, but the ambient lighting is incredibly forgiving. Text me the address." She ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. As she stared down at her own hands gripping the ceramic mug, she felt the terrifying, thrilling weight of the undertaking ahead. Repairing a shattered foundation was infinitely more exhausting than walking away. It demanded the kind of grueling, unglamorous, daily emotional labor that couldn't be resolved with a single dramatic apology or a lavish dinner. They were essentially stripping the house down to the studs and starting over. But as the morning sun finally broke through the gray fog, casting a warm golden rectangle across her kitchen floor, Kate felt a profound surge of resilience. She was an emergency room doctor. She had built her entire existence around stepping into the wreckage, finding the faint pulse, and doing the brutal, necessary work to keep it alive. Later that evening, tucked away in the dimly lit corner booth of a cramped West Village restaurant, they poured glasses of objectively terrible red wine and shared plates of phenomenal pasta. They didn't dissect the manila folder or the hospital lie, not yet. Those grueling, necessary conversations were still waiting in the wings. Instead, they gently navigated the safe waters of their actual lives, the stubbornness of Kate's mother, the gritty years Chris had survived before the money insulated him, the framed anatomy poster he had secretly purchased for his own office, and the burnt lobby coffee she still masochistically drank out of habit. At some point, Chris made a dry observation, and a genuine, breathless laugh escaped Kate's throat. Chris froze, his wine glass hovering inches from his mouth. For a fleeting second, the ruthless billionaire looked exactly like a man who couldn't quite comprehend the sheer, impossible magnitude of his own luck. Kate caught the raw awe in his dark eyes. "Stop!" she commanded, pointing a breadstick at him. "I'm not doing anything. You're being blatantly sincere. It's incredibly unsettling." A slow, devastating grin spread across his face. "Get used to it, Dr. Leigh." Kate held his gaze across the flickering candlelight. The heavy, guarded deadbolt on her heart hadn't magically vanished. It wasn't supposed to. But the door was no longer barricaded shut. It was cracked open, letting the light back in. "Maybe," she murmured softly, and picked up her wine. The balmy heat of a late June evening wrapped around a crowded Chelsea rooftop, the sprawling, luminous grid of the city blazing relentlessly beneath the partygoers. Kate leaned casually against the glass parapet, sharing an intensely specific, highly clinical joke with a visiting doctor from Johns Hopkins that would have completely alienated anyone outside their field. The icy condensation from her gin and tonic beaded against her fingertips, the sharp scent of juniper and summer rain grounding her in the loud, ambient hum of the celebration. Across the sprawling terrace, Chris was pinned in conversation with two titans of the financial sector, politely swirling a neat bourbon he had barely tasted. Through the shifting, glittering crowd, their eyes caught. It carried the quiet, undeniable gravity of two people who had finally laid down their weapons and found solid ground. Chris offered a microscopic, intimate lift of his crystal glass, acknowledging her presence before seamlessly returning his attention to the executives. Kate turned back to her colleague with a radiant, effortless smile, a profound and entirely unfamiliar peace settling deep into her ribs. For 29 years, she had weaponized her independence, fiercely convinced that the ultimate form of strength was a life completely devoid of necessity. She had built a towering fortress to ensure she never needed a single soul, confusing isolation with survival. Yet standing under the hazy summer sky, watching the sharp, familiar line of Chris's jaw from 50 feet away, the absolute truth finally crystallized in her chest. Surrendering her armor hadn't destroyed her. She hadn't let him in because she was terrified of the silence, or because she needed him to function. She had let him in because she had looked at the incredible life she could easily conquer alone, and freely, deliberately chose to share it with him instead. It was a choice completely devoid of fear, a surrender of control that turned out to be the bravest thing she had ever done. The party ebbed and flowed around them, completely oblivious to the quiet, magnetic pull of their orbit. As the Hopkins doctor launched into another complex medical anecdote, Chris gracefully extracted himself from his circle and navigated the crowded rooftop. He moved with a measured, unhurried ease. Kate kept her focus entirely on her conversation, her pulse steady, never once feeling the frantic urge to crane her neck and check if he was still coming. When he finally arrived at her side, he didn't interrupt. He simply stood with her. Kate shifted her weight just a fraction of an inch, allowing the fine wool of his suit jacket to brush against her bare shoulder. The visiting doctor paused mid-sentence, his eyes darting between the two of them, instantly reading the undeniable electric current passing silently between their bodies. New York in June, Kate thought, marveling quietly at the sheer, beautiful impossibility of the last 8 months. The city burned below them, a relentless, brilliant engine racing blindly toward the next moment, indifferent to the quiet victories unfolding above it. Kate took a slow sip of her drink, leaning softly into the solid, unyielding warmth of the man standing beside her. She was finally, absolutely fine with that.